Good afternoon. We start with the first panel of the day. This is largely a fallout of the two speeches that we had from Peter and Vinod, building resilience in the Indian organizations post-COVID. And I think while discussing with one of the panelists, a great idea was that we don't discuss too much of what happened during the pandemic, but we take the trends from the pandemic and visualize what we can do in future and what we have been doing in present. So I will straight away, go to Ashish. And Ashish, you have been dealing with essential commodities and uh, essential product. What has been the major learning from the pandemic in terms of building a more resilient supply chain or resilient planning processes and moving away from the deterministic one? You have to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
So thank you, Dr. Singh, and it's a pleasure for me to be on this forum. I think the question that you asked is a very vast question because there has been so many learnings for all of us in last 6 months. But few things that I would talk about in the context of food FMCG, where I represent the company. One is that all the BCP that we talked about before pandemic, right, and we all convinced ourselves that we had good BCPs in place, was not true. The BCPs were there for a particular site or a particular line or a particular product family. But if there is a crisis across the country, that BCP didn't work. So that was a key learning that we had, that the BCPs we had designed were for a specific or a pocket of disturbance, but not for a pan India, pan country disturbance. So that was the first learning. Second learning was how fast can you start up your supply chain and reach your products on the shelf. There were a lot of theories before the pandemic, and we all believed that we have good resilience, we have adequate safety stock, but we did not realize that your people, your infrastructure could come to a grinding halt. We always said that, look, we may be able to operate with a 50% capacity or a 25% capacity, or, there were various scenarios that we had, but nobody had a scenario where the availability goes to zero. Like, there are no people on the site. So what do you do? So these are a few things which were fundamentally different. The third was in terms of the transparency across the value chain. So we have the transparency across the upstream and downstream supply chain across different functions. But if I were to integrate and start sensing and start taking decision, that capability was very, very slow. So if the pandemic has started, there were shutdowns, and then there was a hope that some factory will start. Consumers were consuming from our safety stock, but to correlate all this and take decisions was a challenge. So we had to create I would not call a war room, but I had to connect all my leaders of the part of the value chain for a DOR, or a daily operations review, where we said, okay, what's happening on the demand side, what's happening with the customers, what's happening with the factories, what's happening with our suppliers, what's happening with our customers, and then take a view and decide. So that was another learning that we had. Then one thing we learned was something called weekly cadence, because all your past history and past planning data was not applicable at that point of time. I'm talking of mid-March to mid-May, 2 months. So we thought that we'll move towards a weekly cadence, and weekly cadence is somehow managing your customer demand and safety stocks by looking at day-to-day replenishment across the value chain, or a weekly replenishment across the value chain. So this is what we learned very quickly, that instead of worrying about a long-term, medium-term forecast, just focus on a weekly cadence and just replenish the whatever safety stock you have planned across the value chain as soon as you can, with the volatility in demand and supply both happening. So that's what another key learning. One key learning was the international supply chain. So we are a FMCG and a MNC. So we believe in creating low-cost country sourcing. We look at economies of scale. So if I have a value chain where an ingredient is getting made in China and it is getting finished in Europe and it is coming to India to be put in a product which is Maggie, and then Maggie has to be sold, that supply chain is 3 or 2.5 months long, and it doesn't work in this. So we need to cut down the length of supply chain, and going local is the solution. So, and there are a lot of learnings, but I will not waste everybody's time here. So these are a few things that we had not anticipated, and yes, we learned the hard way, and we could then manage upscaling of supply chain and reaching our products quicker to the customer. Thank you.
Right. Saurabh, I've been reading Gartner and everybody has been quoting Gartner to build a resilient supply chain or resilient planning processes. What, according to you, can be a resilient planning process now? Given, I think you've already spoken on the forums and brought brilliant perspective to the forums, like what Ashish did right now. But what is a more resilient strategy of demand planning? I think that's where we let us move to, because the focus that I want to have in this is demand planning as such.
Yeah. So Ashish made some very good points, of course, and I don't think there's anything to be added on that. All the things about the reviews, etc. I think they're very, very solid point, and I hear the same being reflected and talked about across industry, right? So if you look at any of the FMCG companies in India, I think they followed a different route. It's just a question of how fast did they recover from that. The only difference which I did see, right, and that's where, coming to your point specifically, was how did they plan during this, both in terms of execution and in demand planning. So Dr. Rakesh, we had been talking about this earlier, and one of the few things which came in the early days of the pandemic was that you need to, frequency of demand planning should go very high. You should be looking at a daily demand planning, weekly demand planning. That was one. But for me, I think what Peter also said was very important. The core principles of supply chain have not changed. I think that's the key point we should keep in mind. The core principles of supply chain have been laid down over hundreds of years. They've been tested, they've been tried through various points. What actually has happened right now is people a lot of times let go of the processes. It is the process which is always going to be important. If you have understood the principles of demand planning, if you've got a robust process around it, you don't need to plan more frequently. See, if you say that I'm going to plan my demand every week, if your supply side, if your execution is not geared up to the same one, what's the point of having multiple sets of data floating around? Number one, even if you plan more frequently, how many people are actually able to see that data? How many times are they able to come back and say, oh, I can make this sense? This entire market has suddenly shifted. It's not going to shift again in a week or so, right? So frequency of planning is not necessarily the answer. I think the most important thing is the core principles have remained the same. Your supply planning, for me, the robustness is the robustness of the system and the processes that you have. Right. So if you have, and I think Oliver Wright has got a good methodology that they test out your supply, your IBP process, etc. They go into your process, they look at the discipline of the process, they look at the structure of the process, and then they look at how do you actually execute that process. I think that takes time. It's not going to be built overnight, but that is my biggest input here. Have a good process, have a very disciplined process, and then build a digital process. I think one of the key things, again, like I said, when we heard a lot of people talking around it, they said, I've got beautiful processes, I've got good systems, none of it works, right? So I'm back to instinct and WhatsApp and emails and phone calls to do my daily execution, right? So a second part of a process for me, besides a disciplined, discussion forum, would be a good digital process where you're able to bring in data from various points, you're able to visualize it, and you're able to present it to the top management who can look at it, look at the trends, look at the graphs from various points, and then make a decision around it. If your data is fragmented, if your data is not transparent, if your data is not visual, it'll be very, very difficult to just say that I have tons and tons of data, but I'm not able to make any sense out of it. I'm not able to provide the actual fodder, right, to take good decisions. So those two things in my thought, Dr. Rakesh, are very, very important: a disciplined process and visualization and interconnected data. Sir, you're mute.
The whole question of visualization is also a larger building the skills of interpreting data, as Vinod said in one of the slides, and interpreting and understanding and making business sense of out is almost a horizontal activity across the organization, and skill sets are very important, and that's one element which I think has remained static. Even during the pandemic or even post-pandemic, we have been more firefighting in terms of our supply chains rather than building in these skills and these processes and these capabilities. But we'll come back to that a little later in the debate. Let me go back to Somnath. Somnath, how has forecasting changed post-pandemic during the unlockdown period? And I think, when I had a first town hall, Saurabh was a little skeptical about forecasting, or there are so many people who said forecasting won't work. And suddenly I see that there is a little focus towards forecasting, and people are realizing how to forecast and the way to forecast. So what are your views on that?
So good afternoon, Dr. Singh, good afternoon, panelists, and all people who have joined in. Interesting question, but I probably break it into two parts. One is that what is changing in the near future, and how do we cope with that? And do we really need to change something in the long term? Is anything fundamentally changing? I think there is no doubt in all our minds that there's something that is definitely changed from the near-term point of view. Right? Especially if you talk about the Indian context, there is a lot of change both from a consumer side. There's a huge consumer behavior. There's a huge change from a market structure. The contribution of the channel mix and so on. And I think there's a lot of self-led, organization-led choices that people are making in terms of assortment, in terms of a lot of trade-offs that we are doing, which Peter also talked about, in terms of cost versus availability, in terms of top line versus bottom line. What is changing now, I think, is people are getting far more sharper in their choices, which probably was not there earlier. So in terms of assortment, we are getting much sharper. We are being much more decisive. In terms of trade-offs between top line and bottom line, what kind of choices we make, I think we are far more decisive. And I think that poses new challenges for the demand planners, particularly because it creates new scenarios for them. I definitely agree to what Saurabh is saying, is that fundamentally the principles do not change. But a lot of things that we were able to do without in the past, I think that we need to include. I mean, we have always been hearing about scenario planning. We have always been hearing about connected supply chain and so on and so forth. But never before, the need for that has arisen so sharply as it is now, right? So principally things do not change, but I think we need to pick and I think explore things which are far more relevant now and work on that. Again, I completely believe that there is a range check that we need to do at a shorter horizon than which is required, whether it is on a weekly basis, whether it's a fortnightly, is the kind of contextual thing. But range checks in terms of assumptions that we have made for creating our scenarios, range checks in terms of new learnings that are happening because of changes in the market. I think this is something we should be doing continuously, and that it does not mean that we change our plans every week, but it definitely means that we get new insights and new inputs, and we probably action out basis that. So I think this is what is in my opinion what we would be looking at in the near term. There would be challenges, there will be efforts which will be significantly higher for the planning team and the demand planners, and also we will also need to look at how do we automate some of this. as we speak, we also understand that the entire value chain or the go-to-market of India is changing, and is not really opened up to the full extent as pre-COVID. And I think it is a journey. It will take some time before it gets. And once that happens and the whole market structure stabilizes, probably we can look at a little more longer horizon and get back to a little more stable ways of forecasting and planning.
Thank you, Somnath. And let me go to Anirudh. Anirudh comes from Mahindra Tractors. He handles automotive, trucks, and buses, the demand planning. Anirudh, what's your view on forecasting as a basis for demand planning? You do a very hardcore forecasting using ML and AI. What is your view on this? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody, to all the panelists and all the attendees who are in the forum. And thank you, Dr. Singh, for directing that question towards me. So, a forecast at the end of the day, I think when everybody said is an estimate of what's going to happen, right? So, given what happened recently, I would say it's an anomalous event, it's an outlier, but you still have to tackle it. So how do you tackle it? I think Mahindra, the part that I plan for across all sectors is spares. And spares planning is something where all your skills come to the fore because the unpredictability is so high. There is nothing, there are few things that are stable, and there is a lot more things that are unpredictable. The tail tends to be longer. In this case, a customer cannot come and say, hey, I don't want this, can you give me an alternative? Or I drive this vehicle, so can I get another spare from somebody else? So the customer is captive, but the requirements are not replaceable. So it's not like you can substitute one demand with something else. So we are managing actively over 70,000 SKUs a month, okay? And the scope of spares across models, across the different segments is different. So for us, we have to keep the vehicle going, right? That's the plan, and that's just not for automotive. It's for farm, it's for trucks, for buses, everything. So first thing we did, we went in phases. At the end of March, when everything shut down, we knew that there's enough inventory in the pipeline because we were planning for April and May. Also, we knew that demand's going to subside, right? Because dealerships are shut, there are no walk-ins happening. Availability of manpower is an issue, and so our supply is shut, right? So whatever we had in the pipeline, and as long as the trucks were moving, whatever we had in the pipeline in the warehouses, we could use that to fulfill demand as and when it's coming, right? So we had enough inventory to buffer any variation of whatever demand was coming. So what was our pipeline? Suddenly, instead of a 1 month or a 45-day pipeline, became like a 90-day pipeline. So as soon as we opened back up in May, guess what? We were fine in May and June, right? So it's not about forecasting per se. I am able to fulfill demand from stock, right? So I know what I have. So I do not need to forecast right now. Let me fulfill my demand from stock. Next situation came in, well, I'm eating up into my inventory, demand's picking up. Should I use my historical data and use these last 2 months as outliers and just go with the same? Should my sales team come back and say, what is the activity happening in the market? So things started coming, like walk-ins have started to increase. My vehicles in the repair shops have starting to go up. So we used some guesstimates because cash was also king. So cash started driving the forecasting, in the sense we went to a weekly frequency of forecasting or replenishing plans, making replenishment plans. But also the fact that all our scenarios started to become very short term. So there were import parts in the pipeline which had longer lead times. Guess what? Let that pipeline come in. Do not add anything more to that pipeline. We'll see what happens. Demand's lesser, so that means I have more than enough in my pipeline. So all those things we started to take. Then manpower became an issue. Okay, now I have enough demand to pick up. I've also placed some requirements on suppliers, but can I really deliver to that level that I want to deliver? So in spares, we try and deliver upwards of 90–95% service. So the question was, at this point in time, if my warehouses are only open for 25% or 30% or 40%, depending on red, white, red, yellow, green, which zone they're coming in, does it even make sense to keep my safety stock so high and increase my pipeline so much when I can only deliver maybe a 70% or a 60%. So immediately you cut your safety stocks down, because now you're saying, well, let me use my existing inventory more wisely. Third thing, when the manpower started coming back up, guess what? These suppliers couldn't ramp up sufficiently enough because the demand was pent up, demand suddenly shot up. So now what do? You still have to react to this. So back orders started to go up. So in those times, conserving cash or delivering service, there has to be a trade-off. And that's what we did. We systematically used our inventory wisely. We used our cash wisely. We tried to use our manpower where it was needed to deliver the critical parts to the service centers. And then we started building our pipeline back again. So to me, the forecast kind of went into the background, and in came your cash management and your supply management and your execution. Instead of SNOP, we went into SNOE. So that would be my feedback, my comments on this.
Thank you, Anirudh. And I think that indeed is a good learning for all of those who are not from the automotive segment and do not deal with spares. And that shows the dynamics of shifting demand in a more random way, and how randomness has to be managed in the process. Going back to Ashish, what are your views in terms of forecasting? I still want, FMCG forecasting processes, how it's changed as a part of your SNOP process.
I think there are a lot of things that we have seen changing. One is during the pandemic, the first 3 weeks, we saw a lot of pantry upstocking. People were stocking up whatever was available, and definitely it was not the consumption-led demand, it was a stocking up demand. The channel mix changed because there was a national lockdown and curfew, so e-commerce took off, and in certain categories we saw that demand went up 5x, 3x of the baseline. So that happened. The modern trade or organized trade didn't have the footfalls. Even still now they are struggling. So the channel mix changed completely. So that is one thing that we need to model going forward, because this is not going to come back to the pre-COVID level. E-commerce penetration has definitely increased manyfold. For FMCG foods, the e-commerce was 3 to 4%. Now we see e-commerce already at 6 to 7%, and our internal estimate shows that it will go to 8 to 9%. But it's not going to go to 20% or 30% like China. So that is one modeling that we need to put in the channel mix. Second is with out of home channel or lockdown, the in-home consumption has gone up. So if you were say in office and you were drinking 2 or 3 cups of coffee, now you're not going to office, but you still like to drink those couple of cups of coffee at home. Now, will you drink mainstream brand, or will you go to a premium brand like Nescafe Gold? So that is another thing that is happening. We see in-home consumption going up and a shift towards premium brand across SEC A and B and big towns. So there's a shift in consumption of consumers that is happening. Now, out-of-home channel will come back sooner or later, right? We already see in lockdown 4 and other things, unlock, it is opening. But will it go back to pre-COVID? Answer is no, in at least the next 12 months, right? So this is again a modeling change that we need to do, where in-home consumption is increasing for certain product categories and a propensity towards the premium brands, which is going up. Third, we saw that people, when and especially in foods, people are concerned about immunity. People are concerned about health, right, and wellness. So all the B brands, or the brands which are not giving assurance of immunity and health and wellness, they have lost out, right? So that's another change which is happening, is how do you position your products to consumers? Earlier, there were a lot of other methods of value proposition that we are giving to consumers, but slowly now everyone is moving towards immunity, health, wellness. So there's a marketing, or the way you target your consumers is also changing, and that will also have a link in terms of what the demand patterns will go in. So that's another thing. The other thing we learned with our social listening skills with our communication team was that a lot of people are Googling or are on Facebook, or the conversations are happening around recipes, different things that they want to cook at home. Now, we need to find a mechanism, and I think machine learning would help there, where we can pick up these conversations. If people are talking about baking cakes at home, yes, they're going to go and buy ingredients which are going to help them bake the cake. Now, do we wait for them to buy from the shelf and then we come to know through our customers that replenishment is done? Or should we have some social listening tools where we know where the conversations are and then we start doing that? So that's another thing that we are doing with our media team and social listening team, that give us some these insights where we know what conversations are happening. Now, how do we model it into our demand planning? We don't know, but we know that something is going to happen, right? So there are a lot of these things which are happening, but I again agree with what Saurabh and Somnath said, that basic processes need to be placed. The SNOP process has to be in place, because you need to plan for medium and long term in terms of your long lead time items, your capacities, your commodities, your materials, your investments. So those processes will remain. We'll have to remodel few of the things that I talked about in our demand planning process. So we use SAS, which is a forecasting platform which uses machine learning. So we have data that we have put in for last 3 years there, but now the last 4 month data is an outlier, and that has to be modeled in. So that work is going on with our demand planning team. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there are some shifts which are fundamental, like e-commerce penetration going up, in-home consumption going up, people move towards premium brand at home in across SEC A and B, and move towards brands which are promising wellness or immunity. So these things need to be modeled, and the weekly cadence that I spoke about, that will work, because we know that what are the safety stocks across the value chain, what should our customer hold, what should our distribution centers hold, what should our suppliers hold. So that in medium term and short term will continue. And I think over a period of time, we'll all be wise and we will find ways and means to manage this chaos, and we'll learn. So that's how we are doing in Nestle, and every month is a new learning. One simple example I'll give you is we are tracking through the AC Nielsen very closely, that how is the consumption coming back, and we saw that consumption was back to 80% in June of the pre-COVID levels, and in July it has reached 102% in urban, but in rural it has gone to 110%. That means rural consumption is actually higher than the pre-COVID consumption now. So that's another thing that we need to see, that what's our route to market in rural, and rural is behaving differently for a lot of reasons, and that also needs to get into our planning processes. So a lot of things we are trying to model, and in some places we win, some places we don't, and we learn. And so it's a very exciting. I've not spent so much of time in demand planning in last 6 months in my career that I've done during pandemic. So very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. I think that that's a very good elaboration of demand planning. And all said and done, all what you said was that we need a good intelligence from the market. And this is the time when intelligence in terms of category consumption, shopper buy frequency, brand preferences, media consumption, and what all that can change the buying behavior, even the length of the pandemic, all those things can change the way you really need to model your data, and this insight has to be the guiding factor in the long run. Yes, the length of this insight may change. Weekly cadence, as you call it, is a good insight into the whole process. I think all three of you at least have pointed out that a robust SNOP process is an important element, and I think listening to Peter saying that nothing has changed, the process remains the same, the issue has changed, and you need to tackle the issues within the processes. I was reading a global report which says that only 33% of the global corporations actually have a successful SNOP. And the most often the mistake they make are short-term focus in their planning, which has become very abound during the pandemic, to the role of the budgets. They're driven by budgets, and not budget is the input process, but budget is what it drives. And third thing is what Anirudh says in terms of SNOP to execution. The execution is very, very different. I also read in those reports that Gartner 25 companies have found a very strong dilemma. And the dilemma is that above the line, they are really doing well, meaning that, there's a great thinking, a great need to come together, partner with senior departments, and also build partnership and bring a kind of a management review, whether it is SNOP or IBP. But below the line, the execution is still in shambles. And this was before the pandemic. This was February, this thing. From that insight, how does one build and strong and robust SNOP processes which would take care of the slush period, but also be a very good in the mid and the long period? Because here is a situation where the mid and long becomes very important as you open up and as you move into more recessionary phase. As you said, rural economy has done well, because if you see the newspaper in Manrega, no takers are there. So much of money in Manrega, everybody has got Manrega jobs in UP, MP, and other areas, saying that they've got 120 rupees per day and they can spend. The rural income has increased primarily because, as Anirudh said, the crops are good. That is, the rural India, so I think the agri-rural India has done extremely well to sustain the demand in the this quarter. How are you going to really plan your SNOP from here on? Because I see SNOP has been a neglected exercise. Some organizations definitely do a great job. Even we have seen it in our demand planning forum, and they submit their for our awards. There's a leap in terms of process orientation, but execution, we have not got enough data to make any comment. So, Saurabh, what are your views?
Yeah, so great question. So I think the big piece, like Ashish said, and I really like that piece, we have not spent so much time in demand planning as we have over the last 4 months. And I think each of the heads of supply chain will clearly talk about that. Second is, of course, around BCP and our execution. So daily thing, it has been about how many trucks you've left today, how many trucks are left, what's the stock level. So everyone is looking at stock much more closely. But in terms of SNOP, I think this is a good time where SNOP has come to the center stage, right? So earlier, a lot of time it was seen as a supply chain function, not as a business critical function. So good thing is the sales and the marketing and the rest of the finance teams have come together and said, what do you think is going to happen in the future? You have to tell me, because I have to do my own working. Where should I put media? Where should I be executing? What should be my financial outlook? So that's one very, very good thing. And I think that's what is important for the future of IBP. It has to become a business function and not a supply chain function. Unfortunately, mostly the expertise lies in supply chain, and that's why it's always seen as a supply chain function. For example, in Kellogg, my supply chain, my IBP head is a former sales guy. So that helps him integrate and understand, what is the sales language being talked about. So that's one. Number two is the demand drivers have changed, right? Marketing has cut down its costs. There's a lot less advertising going on. There's less possibly in-store promotions, etc. And that would mean that your demand is getting changed. So how do you respond to changes in that? So if they are doing more digital advertising, how do you track the impact of advertising? That's going to be important. So do you have someone who looks at ACOS, right, who looks at what's been the advertising cost of sales, as they say in Amazon, or the ROI when you run ads on Flipkart, right? Which of your ads are being more effective, and therefore which products are getting impacted there? Have you built in a tool which can draw in data from the various online e-commerce platforms and then feed it into your demand planning? Do you use that? And that brings to the next one, where basically it is to become more channel focused. Again, Ashish and Somnath have talked about it, right? It's about the channels. So if there's much more coming from e-commerce, does your IBP process do a channel cut? Do they look at changes in the channel which are happening? For example, again, right now we are saying MT is down, right? But MT is not down across the country, perhaps. It is down in places where the MT was co-located in large malls, right? Tomorrow when MT comes back, and maybe they'll come back very, very strongly with all the news which is going around, are you prepared to keep your eye on it, on that channel, and say how is that channel changing, and therefore is your response changing there. So that's the second one. Third one, the fourth one is what if analysis. When we sit down on any demand planning IBP meeting, the CEO of the company would say, okay, you have taken this assumption. Suppose this assumption changes from X to Y. What would be the impact on your demand, right? And you'll see frequently the demand planners immediately start opening their Excel, they'll look around, and then the sales director someone will say, this is what I think will happen. So we need to move away from what I think will happen to a system where you can do this what if analysis and come back with an answer. And another important piece, Doctor, we were talking about this earlier. From 10, 15 years back, I used to work, I worked on something called DMUU, decision making under uncertainty. So it was a tool which was integrated with Excel as well, and it gave you a probability of a particular output happening, right? So you could give a range, or you could give the boundary condition. It would do iterations between 2 or 3 different parameters and come back with the most probable outcome, right? That is something like a what if analysis. You're never going to have a yes or a no answer. We are going to be much more probabilistic, right? So that what if analysis, a system which can help you do that, is extremely important. Now, whether you run it every week, every day, or every month is up to you, right? But whenever a question is asked or an input changes, you need to see, okay, so this has changed. What is going to happen for me? Faster processing and newer engines are obviously, if anyone has not made the change to a digital, IBP process, etc., do it now, because it's no longer about that. If I do this, what is what's the payback I'm going to get? If you don't do it, what is the loss that you are going to make? Is the question that you need to put to your business, right? So faster processing, newer engines, etc., are important. Last part, the fifth part would be, we have to get the connect between demand, supply, forecast. Right now, all of us would talk about M-2 forecast, M-1 forecast within the month outlook. And M+1, we look at our accuracy and we forget about it. How do you use what happened during that month in the M+1, M+2 analysis to improve your IBP process and your demand planning process is what for me is going to be important, because you need to learn from the past, not just saying my accuracy is increasing. Why is it increasing? What are the things that you have done? Was it a sale-led inaccuracy? Was it a demand-led inaccuracy? Was it a supply-led inaccuracy? Build it in, bridge those things. So those 5 or 6 things for me would be very, very important, how it changes in the future.
Thank you, Saurabh. I think that's the way to build some maturity into the SNOP process. But in terms of demand-driven and market-driven approaches, as I think Ashish was talking about, more outside-in variable to be brought in order to build resiliency, how does one really plan the SNOP? Somnath.
So, sorry, one of the things is, a lot of things, that demand data, like he said, Ashish was talking about Nielsen data. We also found that in the beginning for 2-3 months, the demand data completely disappeared. Nielsen was not able to go to the stores. There was no data which was coming in. And like you said, right, the newer data sets, how do you bring it together? Like I said earlier about the visualization piece, right? So it's not just about IBP. It's also about, in a standalone, transparent, sufficient, in fact, excess of data may be available. How do you bring it together to understand what's happening in the market? What is the frequency with which you are able to get that data? So like I talked about on Amazon, right? There's a plethora of data available. How are you using that to make the choices around, what will you do in that particular channel? Those are the type of things which would be important. It may not necessarily sit within IBP, but it will be a very, very important adjunct to it.
That's a good point, Saurabh. Somnath, do you want to still take that question?
Yeah. So,
Sorry, Somnath, my interruption.
What Ashish and Saurabh has also mentioned, that some of the changes that has happened are going to stay, with us. Right? They are not going to change. Maybe to the extent, the extent will change, but the shift towards e-commerce, the behavior changes in, people, preference for, certain categories and kinds of products will remain with us, and probably not only for the next 12 months or maybe, beyond that as well. right? And it also brings us to some of the fundamental questions of planning and forecasting. When we do forecasting, one of the two basic things is that at what level you are going to forecast, and at what level you are going to action it out. I think, and how do you marry that? I think it becomes very a very fundamental question that at what level do you forecast, and then at what level do you take the action. Ideally, both of them should be at the same level. Pre-GST things, when we had a lot of, the GT in FMCG parlance, GT was largely 85% of the business, one ASM, one warehouse, and so on and so forth. Things were far more simpler. You could, forecast at at a warehouse level, and probably action out also at a warehouse level. Things got complicated once the GST happened, consolidation happened. We got a lot of, less number of warehouses and all that, and we still figure out how to go about doing this thing. But I think that with this new situation, with a lot of channel mix changes and all that, it will not be one single level at which we'll have to forecast. And probably we'll also have to see that how do we take those forecasts and probably action at a different level. So that is something that we need to figure out, right? And that will be a complexity that we probably need to identify and deal with, right? So that's one thing. Second thing, I feel this whole pandemic was a sharp rap in the knuckles for many of us. Maybe a lot of people are already doing it, not focusing on some of the fundamentals, right? So our ability to probably this was the time, the last 3-4 months, and never before, the offtake data and probably the Nielsen data and so on and so forth were far more aggressively discussed in demand planning and S&OP than ever before, right? And I think we need to take it forward. And this is something we have always been told that you need to look at the fundamental demand signals, right? And so how do you integrate this? You might have fabulous infrastructure. You might have best in world-class softwares to help you with that. But even if you don't have, in your own simple way, every organization should probably start looking at how do we integrate those basic demand signals and build into our forecasting process. So one is that having forecasting at multiple levels and then clubbing it to your action level. Second thing is that the basics which probably we picked up in the last 4 months in terms of forecasting basis, looking at early demand signals or the basic demand signals like offtakes and so on, would become something that we need to capitalize and build upon. Third thing, particularly with the change in the shift of channels that we are seeing, we are also beginning to see a lot more of data being available. Those fundamental data in terms of, if you're talking about your e-commerce, a lot of data you get in terms of, visibility about, what is your losses you had while someone was viewing your product, like, they have something of that sort. Then you also have, on-shelf availability data and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of data availability which has come through in the last 4-5, and I think they are much more open to share it now because they are also feeling that it's critical so that we also together replenish the consumer demand. So that is changing, and probably we need to use that data to build into our forecasting process. Third thing, I believe while doing so, we will also need to reach out and collaborate far more strongly with our customers, right? So a customer collaboration, how do we have a organized way of collaborating with the customer in terms of planning out big events, planning out business as usual, which is no more business as usual, business as unusual, but nonetheless. So I think this customer collaboration also will become far more important. And you will see some elements of it also spilling over in the general trade as well. While we tend to believe that general trade is all managed by distributors and so on, but we'll also begin to see, because businesses are looking at sharper segments within the general trade as well. And you are getting a lot of sub channels and so on and so forth. So that part also will become very important. Three things. One is that how do you look at what level you're forecasting, how do we aggregate and do the action planning. Second thing is that build on the fundamental shift that we have done in terms of looking at basic demand signals, offtakes and so on and so forth. And third thing is in terms of building on customer collaboration. And I think a lot of things have already been covered by Saurabh and Ashish in the past.
All right. Thank you, Somnath. I think that's a good way to put the forecasting together. I think multi-forecast you meant granular forecast, right?
And they'll be very happy to hear me say that, right?
Yeah, granularity is going to stay. I think Ashish also had a similar view. Ashish also have gone granular in a large number of sense in terms of forecasting. Ashish, if that's right.
Yes, you're right, Dr. Singh, and we have to get granular because times are changing. The change that is taking place is very, very rapid, and it is not in unidirectional change. So change is also happening in different directions. So it's not that modern trade is down, it'll stay down, it'll come back, as Saurabh was saying. So the change is not unidirectional, it will keep on changing. So we'll have to be very, very granular, and we need to have more and more people who understand the consumer behavior. So I'm investing a lot of time in my team for them to understand the consumer behavior and what is happening at marketplace, so that they can take those learnings and start forecasting. So yes, the machine learning will stay, but the human connect will never go.
Right. All right. I think we have one more panelist. He got a little bit ignored because his video is not there. I thought he has not joined. Amlan Bose he was the ex-head of supply chain from Ford Motors. Amlan, sorry for this. I thought you have not joined. I just got a message from Jason. What are your views in terms of the new computing system that has come up, and how are they going to be helpful in terms of understanding forecast and aligning supply chain?
Yeah. Good evening, Doctor. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks to all the panelists and the audience. And I regret apologies some problem with the app that the camera is not working. I heard all the panelists, and of course, FMCG is a sector where the SNOP has to be done at a very, very micro level, much more granular level than perhaps what Anirudh mentioned in his peer side of the automotive or on my side of production process of manufacturing, large manufacturing, global automotive multinational. They're a little different. But what this crisis has taught us is even though we used to feel that we are producing cars for the last 100+ years as Ford Motor Company, but we realize that we don't know what we don't know. For example, we do often say end-to-end supply chain, end-to-end visibility, end-to-end logistics, and end-to-end digitization. But we very soon realize that beyond the tier 1 and the tier 2 supplier, we have no idea where is the tier 3, tier 4, or tier X. And that was one of the major gap which caught us literally red-handed in few days because we simply don't know that if I cut off Wuhan, if I cut off a section of Shanghai port, if I cut off a section or an airport in Spain and France, what are the vehicle lines I can still continue to produce? Because I simply do not have a visibility of playing around with my model mix, supplier, geography, port infrastructure, and all that. So it was very critical learning for us. Now you cannot practically feasibly control all your T1 to T8 database manually. So you have to go digital, and digitization is the only way where you pull in all because there are thousands and thousands of suppliers, right? If you have to, if a car has say 2,500 odd parts, imagine with all the vehicle lines that we're producing globally. So that is one learning where we are focusing much more on data analytics, digitization journey, and of course using AI and ML to gather that data so that in future when it happens, the way we will be looking at resilience in an automotive multinational is not how I can continue to producing more, because I cannot. Going by the fact that we just maintain 4 hours of inventory inside of a plant, we can never practically continue to produce endlessly. For us, the resilience would mean that if there is an earthquake, God unforeseen, it happens in Japan, or if suppose the next epidemic were to happen, say in Spain, in such a situation, what all the plants which have to be shut down, and what are the plants which can continue to produce seamlessly, that visibility, that single source of truth has to be in front of all the leadership, right in front in the laptop screen or in front in the table, so that becomes a resilient process for us knowing exactly how an act of God in future is affecting us, and yet we can survive and continue to sell a different set of models in different set of countries and all. That's one. The other thing is if anything COVID has done to us, for us, our industry, or be it automotive or be it logistics supply chain, is it has created the urgency for digitization. And when we're talking of digitization, of course, TMS, pretty much all the global manufacturers have a very sophisticated TMS, and we are running it. But what we are now also moving towards is not only AI and ML, but also the future lies with quantum computing driven AI, ML, and quantum inspired algorithm. That's where our future lies. Of course, by all estimates, it's another 3-4 years down the line. But that's where we will, because having a quantum computing power or quantum computing power with you, it's literally, you're not now talking of traveling, say, few miles or few thousand miles. You're actually talking of traveling the power of in intergalactic travel kind of an power you have. So that means you should be able to change your whole paradigm of how you restructure yourself in silos, break those silos of organizations, functions, verticals, countries, regions, and should be able to centralize and run, for example, the whole TMS or whole supply chain from a single location, powered by the quantum computing, quantum-enabled algorithm, quantum-enabled AI and ML, and you should be able to run the entire Ford Motor Company enterprise as if from one single location, because that's the kind of power that digitization and the quantum computing power has given you. So the organizations have in future have to undergo a severe change in their behavioral pattern, in their cultural pattern, and also the most important part of it would be the human centricity, because as many of the panelists were saying, that howsoever technology driven or tech savvy you go, human centricity and human ingenuity is in the center of it. So you always have to take that into consideration and build it around it. So I feel this crisis has really showed us some very exciting way forward for the future.
All right. I think, Anirudh, do you have something to add on that?
Yes, I was just getting impatient and I wanted to jump in on the discussion. So I think everybody here, from Ashish to Somnath to Saurabh, and I think Amlan, mentioned about the changing patterns in demand, right? The consumer behavior has changed. So how do I sensitize myself to this changing? And I'll try and stitch together all this thing in terms of the demand and supply planning scenario, what that means. So let's say everybody has demand clusters, right? So my demand is split in different channels by different customer segments. The portfolio of my product and how I segment. When I say segment, I need to know even better now what my customers are, who they are, and what they need. As much as we would like to think that this is an art, there is also a very good component of data that is already available to you. So one thing where these algorithms, and I'm talking simple, plain statistical algorithms of regression. I'm just going to take a simple example. You can apply machine learning to try and tell you now what my demand clusters look like, what factors make this a cluster, and what are the characteristics that define that cluster, right? So this is my task. I want to find out who's going to buy, what they're going to buy, and what that buying is going to look like. So first question we need to address, which we can using machine learning, is what are the attributes of my product and what attributes are desired by what customer segment. So this is a classification problem in machine learning. Okay, first thing. Second thing, once I've determined that, okay, I have these different customers, then I have to determine how am I going to fulfill the demand, right? And that's where the whole demand and supply comes in. You cannot have a one size fits all. One thing is for sure. There are certain customers who require fulfillment from certain channels. There are certain customers who require a certain pricing into it. So again, as much as we would like to believe we know what our customers are and I know what they're going to do, at worst, the machine learning can validate your hypothesis, one thing. Secondly, it can give you these additional insights that no matter how smart you are, a human brain cannot compute that. Okay, you'd be surprised what you will find by mixing and matching how your different clusters tend to look like, where there is overlap, what are unique clusters, why are those unique, and what are those characteristics. Often those go hidden and we do not tend to react. So I'm just giving you a simple example. Let's say the weather, the pricing, the number of vehicles, the part of country you are in. These are just 5-6 factors I've quickly named. Each has different levels. If I look at this problem, then I have 5 factors at 3 different levels. Can you imagine the combinations, right? Those who are math savvy in us will say, well, 5 different factors, 2 different levels, 32 combinations, right? These are my clusters I'm going to target. Can you target 32 customers? Especially now, S&OP has now become constrained. Earlier used to be, well, I know my demand, I'll figure out everything else. Demand drives it, so everybody else in the supply chain will figure out how to bring that to me. No longer true. Supply is constrained, guys. You cannot just say, I'm going to sell this. If you do not have the materials and ingredients to make it, where would you dedicate your limited cash that you have at this time if your cash is constrained? Where would you direct these resources? What do you want to make? How you want to make? How much profit you want to make? So now supply is constrained. So no longer S&OP is unconstrained S&OP, which is on paper. It is real now. It is constrained S&OP. Your supply is constrained. Your operations are constrained. Your factories are not running to full tilt. So that second aspect. The third aspect, which I wanted to bring in. So I mentioned this, and then, yeah, the fundamental difference between time series forecasting and causal forecasting, okay, which is machine learning. Time series forecasting says, if I know my past, I will predict my future. If my past is not representative of my future, guess what? All that data is of no use to you, right? However, if you give time series enough time and you have enough data points, time series will pick up even your recent trends. So no longer can we wait today for time series to have enough data points to give me the future. That's where machine learning comes in. If I'm able to model the behavior of my customers and I know what parameters drive their demand, if I know what the input is, so it's like a y is a function of x for those who are mathematically inclined among us. So if I know the different x's and I know the levels those x's are, now I know what my y is. So this is forecasting what that cluster will need. So it's no longer a classification problem, it becomes a regression problem. Now I need to know which cluster is going to buy what. If I know the x's, I can predict the y. And that's where machine learning comes in. So the x's need to be known, and if I know x's today, the past data is still helpful to me because it still can use the x's and tell me with some level of noise. Every model has noise. So I just wanted to put these 3 things because Vinod spoke on this. I know Peter spoke about what has changed with the issue. The tools, the approach hasn't changed. You can still apply all the different tools, just have to be more sensitive to what's happening behind the scenes. It's no longer a black box. You have to get your hands dirty. You need to know what these things are doing for you.
Unless you have sufficient data, even your causal series, which depends upon certain variables, when you have a rational OLS assumptions, is a time series. And I think that is where the problem even can lie with the time series when the times are very different. And this is why, even the causal can be time series. But that's for another day to debate. We don't want to get into that. Let me come back to one question, to 3-4 questions, but they all have one basic patterns. And they are all about consumer behavior changes and how do you tackle. And I think we have discussed enough on this, but I will just ask Saurabh to wrap it up with that.
So, there was much
audio
connection is.
Saurabh, your audio is not clear at all.
Can you hear me now?
All right, Somnath, you should take the question. Saurabh, audio is not available.
Yeah.
All right. Quickly in a minute, so we are out of time. We digress, but I think that was needed.
So basically, you want me to summarize on the changes from the consumer side. If I'm not wrong, that's what you're talking about.
There are 3 questions on the same topic.
Okay.
Sagar, Imrani, then Rajiv Kumar. So let's address that question at least once again.
On the consumer side, Dr. Singh, I'm not clear on the question.
What is the impact of consumer behavior and how can you define agility by incorporating them in your planning?
Right. So I think, Anirudh talked about the execution part, way in the beginning of our discussion, and I think, execution end of the day is the proof of the pudding, right? So, we, end of the day, we do all kinds of planning, all kinds of, fantastic work in terms of, finding out what needs to be done and all that. But as Ashish has spoken at the beginning, and, Anirudh was also stressing upon, all kinds of BCP and planning falls apart when a crisis of this kind, comes through. It is definitely about the quality and level of execution, and execution, of course, means that you are completely having a end-to-end visibility and managing it as a crisis. From a consumer point of view, Dr. Singh, if you ask me, as we have also discussed in the last part of the previous part of the discussion, people are looking at being safe. Number one, people are looking at getting into categories and products where there is an assurance of at right now it's about hygiene and immunity and all that, but over a period of time it will move into a brand promise and quality of the product. So right now what is top of mind is hygiene, whether it is free of all kinds of diseases and all that, but eventually it will get into a product which promises higher quality, higher value from a quality standpoint, right? So that is one change which is happening. Definitely the whole shift towards e-commerce is going to stay. People have tasted the benefit of it, and people have tasted the convenience of it. And also people have shared a lot of their innovations about this channel, which was earlier there. A lot of people were not onto this channel primarily because they were not very sure whether it's the right place, whether my money would be lost, and so on and so forth. But given the current circumstances, people have come, tasted it, checked it, it is working for them. Some people will completely, stay on. Having said that, some of the shift that we are seeing in the recent short term in terms of your large format retails not really doing great. I think it is a matter of time. Things will come back, and we should be completely keeping our watch on that so that we are not caught in the wrong foot when these things come back. So these are the 2-3 things which I feel are there from a consumer point of view. I think other things in terms of shifts about rural, urban, and all that. I think these are circumstantial, and it will keep on changing over a period of time.
Thank you, Somnath, and I think we all agree with what you have said. It's time to end the panel. We are just overshot by some 10 minutes, but that's fine. I thank Ashish, Saurabh, Anirudh, Somnath, and Amlan for being such a wonderful panelist and bringing in very diverse and very interesting and very useful information for the demand planners to take back and start working on it. Thank you very much.